They dragged her through the mud in her white wedding dress, screaming that she was cursed. A whole town, blinded by superstition and drought, stood on the banks of Dead Man's Lake, ready to watch an innocent woman drown just to appease their fear. They tied stones to her ankles. The water was rising. Hope was gone. But just as the first wave hit her chin, the ground shook, not from thunder, but from the hooves of $1,000 stallion. A man everyone feared was about to do the one thing nobody expected. He didn't just save her life, he claimed it. This is the story of how a drowning bride became the queen of the Wild West. The year was 1887, and the Wyoming heat was enough to drive a sane man into madness. But in the isolated settlement of Serenity Springs, the madness had already taken root. Lorraine Rainey Sterling spat a mouthful of grit and blood onto the dry earth. Her hands were bound behind her back with rough hemp rope that bit into her wrists, chafing the skin raw. But the pain in her wrists was nothing compared to the terror seizing her chest. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears and sweat at the faces of people she had known her entire life. Neighbors, friends, the baker who had sold her bread just last week. Now they looked like strangers. Their faces were twisted into masks of desperate hatred. "It's her!" screamed Mrs. Gable, pointing a shaking, bony finger at Rainey. "Since she came of age, the rain stopped. Her womb is dry, and so is the land. She's a witch, I tell you, a bride of the devil." "Drown the witch!" a man shouted from the back. It was Thomas Miller, a man Rainey had once danced with at the Harvest Festival. Rainey tried to scramble backward, her satin wedding dress heavy with dust and ripped at the hem tangling around her legs. She was supposed to be married today, not to a man she loved, but to Jebediah Holt, the town's wealthiest merchant, a man 3 times her age. It was a transaction, her father had said, a way to save their failing farm. But Jebediah had died of a heart attack 2 days ago, right at the altar during the rehearsal. That was the spark that lit the powder keg. The town, suffering from a 6-month drought, decided it wasn't a coincidence. They decided Rainey was cursed. They said she killed her groom with black magic. And the only way to bring the rain back, according to the fanatical new preacher Reverend Malachi Graves, was to wash the sin from the earth. Reverend Graves stepped forward now. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that looked like burnt coal. He held a Bible in one hand and a heavy stone in the other. "Lorraine Sterling," Graves bellowed, his voice cracking over the wind. "You have brought pestilence to Serenity Springs. You have murdered a righteous man with your hexes. The water will judge you. If you sink, you are innocent and may find peace in heaven. If you float, well, we shall ensure you do not float." 2 burly farmhands grabbed Rainey by the arms, hauling her up. She screamed, trashing against them, her heels digging furrows into the cracked mud. "Father, please," she cried out, searching the crowd for the one face that should have been fighting for her. She saw him. Arthur Sterling stood near the wagons, his head bowed, his hat in his hands. He didn't look up. He was a coward, broken by debt and fear. He was letting them kill his only daughter because he was too afraid of the mob. "Don't do this," Rainey sobbed, the fight draining out of her as they dragged her onto the wooden dock that jutted out into the murky, stagnant water of Dead Man's Lake. "I didn't do anything, I'm just a girl. Tie the stones," Graves commanded, cold and sharp. They forced her down onto the rotting wood planks. The smell of the lake was foul dead fish and decaying algae. Rough hands tied a heavy sack of rocks to her ankles. The weight was immense. She could feel it dragging her down even before she hit the water. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, God." "Cast her in," Graves said. The hands pushed. For a second, Rainey was weightless, suspended in the hot Wyoming air. Then the cold, dark water swallowed her whole. The shock was imminent. The water rushed into her nose and mouth. The weight at her ankles yanked her straight down into the gloom. She kicked, she thrashed, but the stones were an anchor of judgment. The light from the surface began to fade, turning from a bright yellow to a dull, murky green. Her lungs burned. Her wedding dress billowed around her like a ghostly shroud. This is it, she thought, her mind going strangely quiet. I am going to die here alone in the dark. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. Garrett Thorne did not like Serenity Springs. He didn't like the people, he didn't like the smell, and he certainly didn't like the self-righteous hypocrisy that hung over the town like a storm cloud. He sat atop Obsidian, his massive black Hanoverian stallion on the ridge overlooking Dead Man's Lake. At 32, Garrett was the most powerful man in the territory. He owned the Iron Ridge Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and timber that dwarfed the pathetic holdings of the Serenity Springs settlers. He adjusted the brim of his black Stetson, his steel-grey eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfolding below. He had ridden out here to settle a land dispute with the late Jebediah Holt, only to find a lynching in progress. "Boss," his foreman, Red Cooley, grunted from the horse beside him. "Looks like they're drowning a woman down there." Garrett watched the splash. He saw the white dress disappear beneath the surface. He felt a cold rage ignite in his gut. He had seen men hanged for rustling, and he had shot men for cheating, but killing a woman in a wedding dress. That was a special kind of evil. "Not today," Garrett growled. He spurred Obsidian. The horse launched forward, galloping down the steep, rocky slope with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. Red and the 3 other ranch hands followed their dust cloud rising behind them like a declaration of war. Down at the dock, the townspeople were silent, watching the bubbles rise. Reverend Graves was muttering a prayer. Suddenly the thunder of hooves shattered the silence. The crowd turned gasping, scrambling out of the way, as Garrett Thorne rode straight onto the muddy bank, not slowing down until he was inches from the dock. "Get her out!" Garrett roared, his voice booming louder than the preacher's. He drew his Colt Peacemaker and fired a single shot into the air. The crack was deafening. The farmhands on the dock froze. "I said get her out, or I'll fill this lake with your bodies instead." Garrett aimed the gun directly at Reverend Graves's head. Graves went pale. "This is God's will, Mr. Thorne. She is a witch. She's a woman, you lunatic." Garrett holstered his gun, leaped from his horse, and didn't hesitate. He sprinted down the dock and dove into the water. The water was freezing and murky. Garrett kept his eyes open, stinging in the gloom. He saw the white shape below, sinking deeper. He kicked hard, his powerful strokes, fighting the drag of his boots and gun belt. He reached her. She was limp, unconscious. He grabbed her waist, then reached down to her ankles. He felt the rope. He pulled a Bowie knife from his boot, slashed frantically at the hemp, and felt the weight of the rocks fall away. He kicked toward the surface, his lungs screaming for air, hauling Rainey with him. They broke the surface with a gasp, Garrett dragging in huge gulps of air. He swam to the bank, hauling her lifeless body onto the mud. "Back off!" Red Cooley shouted at the crowd, his shotgun leveled at them. The ranch hands formed a perimeter around Garrett and the girl. Garrett turned Rainey onto her side and struck her back firmly. "Breathe, damn it! Breathe!" A second passed. 2. Then a convulsive cough. Water spewed from her lips, and she gasped a ragged, desperate sound. She vomited lake water and bile, trembling violently. Garrett brushed the wet hair from her face. She was pale as death, shivering, her lips blue. But she was alive. He stood up, towering over the cowering townspeople. He was soaked, his expensive suit ruined his eyes, blazing with a fury that made grown men step back. "Who did this?" Garrett demanded. "Who ordered this? She killed Jebediah." Graves stammered, trying to regain his authority. "She is cursed. She has no one to speak for her. Her father gave her to the water." Garrett looked at Arthur Sterling, who was hiding behind a wagon wheel. Garrett spat on the ground in disgust. "She has no one." Garrett walked up to Graves, stopping inches from his face. "You're wrong. She has me," the crowd murmured. Thorn, the Baron of Iron Ridge. "You cannot interfere," Graves hissed. "She is unmarried. An unowned woman is subject to the town's moral laws. Unless a man claims responsibility for her soul, she belongs to the judgment of the church." It was an archaic, twisted interpretation of frontier law, but out here, the law was whatever the man with the loudest voice said it was. Graves was trying to use technicalities to finish his murder. Garrett looked down at Rainey. She was looking up at him, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. She was beautiful even in this state, but more than that, she looked broken. And Garrett Thorn had a habit of fixing broken things. He made a decision that would change the course of the territory. "She isn't unmarried." Garrett lied, his voice steady as granite. Graves blinked. "What?" Garrett turned to the crowd. "I said she isn't unmarried. I'm claiming her. Right now." He turned to the shivering girl in the mud. He knelt down, ignoring the mud soaking his knees. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Rainey, she chattered. "Lorraine." "Rainey," Garrett said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I am Garrett Thorn. I own the land from here to the Sun River. If you want to live, if you want to leave this hell, you will marry me. Right here, right now." Rainey stared at him. He was a stranger, a dangerous, violent stranger. But he was warm, and he was offering a hand while everyone else offered a stone. She nodded. "Yes." Garrett stood up and grabbed Graves by the collar of his frock coat. "You're a preacher, aren't you, Marius?" I cannot. It is sacrilege." Garrett's hand went to his gun. "You tried to drown an innocent woman. That's sacrilege. Marrying us is your penance. Do it, or I take you to the sheriff in Laramie for attempted murder." Graves looked at the gun, then at the angry ranch hands, and finally at the mob that was slowly losing its bloodlust in the face of true power. "Fine," Graves spat. There on the muddy banks of Dead Man's Lake, with frogs croaking and the smell of death in the air. Garrett Thorn took Rainey's cold, wet hand in his. "Do you, Garrett?" Graves mumbled. "Skip the sermon," Garrett snapped. "Do we are husband and wife?" "Yes, say the words." "I pronounce you man and wife," Gravesdown whispered, hatefully. "What God has joined, let no man tear asunder." Garrett finished, darkly glaring at the crowd. "Anyone touches her, anyone looks at her wrong, they answer to the Iron Ridge." He scooped Rainey up into his arms. She was light, frail. He carried her to Obsidian and lifted her onto the saddle, swinging up behind her. He wrapped his heavy duster coat around her shivering shoulders. "Let's ride," Garrett commanded his men. As they galloped away from Serenity Springs, Rainey leaned back against the solid, warm chest of the stranger, who was now her husband. She didn't know if she was safe, or if she had just traded one monster for another. But as the town faded into the dust, she knew one thing: she was alive. The ride to Iron Ridge was grueling. For the first hour, Rainey drifted in and out of consciousness. The adrenaline of the near drowning was fading, replaced by a bone-deep chill that the Wyoming sun couldn't touch. Garrett held her steady, with one arm wrapped firmly around her waist. He didn't speak. He felt like a statue, hard, unyielding, and silent. Rainey's mind raced. Garrett Thorn. She had heard the stories. They said he was richer than the governor and twice as ruthless. They said he had built his ranch on the ashes of his enemies. Why would a man like that save a dirt-poor farmer's daughter? Why would he marry her? Maybe he needed a servant, a cook, or maybe the stories about his cruelty were true, and he just wanted a toy. "You're shaking." His voice rumbled against her back. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. It was factual. "I'm cold," she stammered. Garrett signaled to Red. The group slowed to a trot. Garrett reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a silver flask. "Drink. It's whiskey. It'll burn, but it'll warm you." Rainey took the flask with trembling hands. She took a sip and coughed as the amber liquid seared her throat, but the warmth bloomed in her stomach almost instantly. "Thank you," she whispered, handing it back. "Don't thank me yet," Garrett said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We aren't home." They rode for another 3 hours, climbing higher into the foothills. The landscape changed from the flat, dusty scrub of the basin to the rugged, pine-dotted cliffs of the highlands. Finally, they crested a ridge, and Rainey gasped. Below them lay a valley that looked like paradise compared to Serenity Springs. A massive river cut through lush, green pastures. Hundreds, no thousands of cattle grazed in the distance, and in the center, perched on a rise, was a sprawling log and stone mansion. It was a fortress of luxury. "Iron Ridge," Garrett said. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne." The title made her stomach flip. Mrs. Thorne. They rode into the main courtyard. Dozens of ranch hands stopped their work to stare. They tipped their hats to Garrett, but their eyes lingered on Rainey Wet Dirty, wearing a ruined wedding dress and wrapped in the boss's coat. Garrett dismounted and reached up, helping her down. Her legs wobbled, and she nearly collapsed. He caught her effortlessly. "Martha!" Garrett shouted toward the house. A stout older woman with a stern face and a white apron bustled out onto the porch. She looked at Rainey, her eyes widening. "Lord have mercy, Mr. Thorne," Martha exclaimed. "What on earth did you drag in?" "My wife," Garrett said simply. "Martha froze." Rosamos, the ranch hands within earshot, stopped dead. A pin drop could have been heard in the dirt. "Your wife," Martha blinked. "Get her a hot bath, clothes that fit, and food," Garrett ordered, ignoring the shock rippling through his staff. "Burn that dress. I never want to see it again." "Yes, sir." Martha recovered quickly, her professional demeanor taking over. She hurried down the steps and took Rainey's arm gently. "Come on, child. Let's get you out of those wet rags." Rainey looked back at Garrett. He was already talking to Red, pointing at a map back to business, as if he hadn't just married a stranger. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly. He stopped and turned. His grey eyes bored into hers. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do it?" Garrett looked at her for a long moment. His expression softened just a fraction, revealing a hint of something that looked like regret, or perhaps calculation. "Because I hate a bully, Lorraine," he said, "and because I need something from you." Rainey's blood ran cold. "What do you need?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "That land your father owns, the one backing onto the canyon. It's the key to the water rights for this whole territory. Graves and Holt knew it. That's why they wanted you dead, so the land would revert to the bank, and they could buy it for pennies." Rainey was stunned. "My father's farm. It's dust. It's worthless." "It's sitting on an aquifer," Garrett said intensely. "And now that you're my wife, they can't touch it. And they can't touch you." He stepped back the wall, going up again. "Go with Martha. Dinner is at 7. Don't be late." As Rainey was led away into the massive house, her head was spinning. He had saved her for water. He had married her for land. She felt a pang of disappointment. Of course, she thought bitterly. It's always a transaction. But as she soaked in the copper tub filled with steaming water, scrubbing the mud of Dead Man's Lake from her skin, she remembered the way he had looked at the mob, the way he had shielded her body with his own. He might have married her for land, but he had saved her with a ferocity that didn't feel like business. That night, dinner was a silent affair. The dining room was cavernous, lit by a crystal chandelier. Garrett sat at the head of the long table. Rainey sat at his right. She wore a blue velvet dress that Martha had found. It was slightly too big, but the color brought out the green in her eyes. Garrett ate with precise mechanical movements. He cut his steak, chewed, and drank his wine without looking at her. "So," Rainey said, her voice echoing in the large room, "what happens now?" Garrett wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "Now you live here. You are safe. You have credit at the general store in Laramie. You can do whatever you like." "And us?" Rainey asked, her face flushing. "We are married." Garrett paused. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to her lips, then snapping back to her eyes. "We are married on paper, Rainey. This is a partnership. I protect you. I get the water rights to secure the valley. I won't impose on you." He stood up. "I sleep in the east wing. Your rooms are in the west. You'll find the door has a lock. Use it if it makes you feel safer." He turned to leave. "Garrett." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for saving me, even if it was for business." Garrett didn't turn around. "Good night, Rainey." Rainey watched him leave. She felt a strange mixture of relief and something else. Frustration. She went to her room. It was luxurious, with a 4-poster bed and silk sheets. She locked the door as he suggested. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside. But sleep wouldn't come. She kept thinking about Serenity Springs. Reverend Graves wouldn't give up this easily. If Garrett was right about the aquifer, that water was worth millions. Men killed for much less in the West, and her father, he had let them take her. A sudden noise startled her. A crash from downstairs. Rainey sat up, her heart pounding. She heard shouting, gunfire. She jumped out of bed and ran to the window. In the moonlight, she saw shadows moving near the stables. Someone had set fire to the hay barn. Flames were licking up the side of the structure. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick and unlocked her door, stepping into the hallway. "Garrett!" she screamed. She ran toward the stairs, but a hand shot out from the shadows of an alcove, clamping over her mouth. "Quiet, witch!" a voice hissed in her ear. It wasn't a ranch hand. It was one of the men from the dock, one of Graves' zealots. "The preacher sends his regards," the man whispered, pulling a knife. Rainey bit down hard on the man's hand. He yelped and loosened his grip. She swung the candlestick backward with all her might, connecting with his skull with a sickening crack. The man slumped to the floor. Rainey didn't wait. She hiked up her gown and ran toward the east wing. "Garrett!" "They're inside." The doors to the east wing burst open. Garrett Thorne emerged wearing only his trousers, a Winchester rifle in his hands. His chest was bare, scarred, and muscular. "Get down!" he roared. He fired over her shoulder. Rainey dropped to the floor as a bullet whizzed past her ear. Behind her, another intruder tumbled down the stairs. Garrett sprinted to her, hauling her up with one hand while firing the rifle with the other. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes wild. "No," she gasped. "The barn is on fire." "I know," Garrett said. "It's a distraction." "For what?" "For you," Garrett said grimly. "They didn't come for the horses. They came to finish the job." He dragged her into his bedroom and kicked the door shut, barring it. He went to the window, shattering the glass with the butt of his rifle to fire at the men below. "Reload this," he ordered, tossing her a Colt revolver from his nightstand. Rainey caught the heavy gun. Her hands were shaking, but she remembered how to load a gun from her days on the farm. She snapped the cylinder open. "I thought you said I was safe here," she shouted over the crack of gunfire. "I was wrong." Garrett fired 2 shots, dropping a man in the courtyard. He turned to look at her, his face smeared with soot, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "Nowhere is safe until Graves is dead." He walked over to her, took the loaded revolver, and pressed a fresh box of ammo into her hand. "Stay here. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me or Martha, you shoot them. You understand? You shoot to kill." "Where are you going?" Rainey cried. "I'm going to teach Serenity Springs a lesson." Garrett said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "They wanted a war. I'm going to give them a massacre." He unlocked the door and vanished into the smoky hallway. Rainey stood alone in the dark room, the gun heavy in her hand, the flames from the barn casting dancing shadows on the wall. She wasn't the crying girl on the dock anymore. The fear was burning away, replaced by the same cold anger she had seen in Garrett's eyes. She cocked the hammer of the revolver. "Let them come," she whispered. The gunfire died out just before dawn. Rainey hadn't moved from her spot by the heavy oak wardrobe, the Colt revolver gripped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The smell of smoke was acrid, seeping under the door frame, mixing with the metallic scent of spent gunpowder. She heard heavy boots in the hallway. She raised the gun, her heart hammering against her ribs. A knock. 3 sharp raps. "Rainey, it's me. Open the door." It was Garrett. Her breath left her in a rush of relief so potent it made her dizzy. She fumbled with the lock and threw the door open. Garrett stood there looking like a demon risen from the pits. His face was streaked with soot and sweat. His chest, still bare, was heaving. But what drew her eye was the dark, slick stain spreading across the left shoulder of his trousers, where blood dripped from a wound in his upper arm. "You're hurt," she breathed, stepping forward without thinking. "It's a graze," he grunted, walking past her into the room and dropping heavily onto the edge of the bed. He laid his Winchester rifle across his knees. "We got 4 of them. 2 got away. They won't be back tonight." Martha bustled in seconds later, carrying a basin of hot water and clean rags. Her face pale, but set in grim determination. "Lord Almighty, Mr. Thorne," she tutted, setting the basin down. "They burned the North Hay barn to the ground, but the stock is safe. Red is organizing a bucket brigade to damp down the embers." "Let the barn burn," Garrett said, wincing as he tried to move his left arm. "We need to patch this up before I ride out." "You're not riding anywhere," Rainey said, her voice surprisingly firm. Garrett looked up at her, his brows drawing together. "Excuse me." Rainey took the basin and rags from Martha. "You've lost blood. You're exhausted. If you ride out now, you'll fall out of the saddle before you reach the property line." Martha fetched the whiskey and his sewing kit. Martha looked between the towering cattle baron and the slight girl in the oversized velvet dress, then gave a curt nod. "Yes, ma'am." She hurried out. Garrett stared at Rainey. Nobody gave him orders. Not on Iron Ridge. But the look in her green eyes wasn't defiance. It was a steely practicality that he recognized from looking in the mirror. "You think you can stitch me up, little witch," he growled, but there was no heat in it. "I grew up on a farm, Garrett. I've stitched horses' dogs in my father's leg when he cut it with a scythe. You're just a bigger animal." He actually chuckled. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound. Fair enough. For the next hour, Rainey worked. She cleaned the jagged furrow where the bullet had torn through the muscle of his bicep. He didn't flinch when she poured the alcohol over it, though his jaw muscles bunched tight enough to crack a walnut. She sewed the wound closed with neat, tight stitches, her hands steady, despite the exhaustion dragging at her. The proximity was intoxicating. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin. She saw the road map of scars across his chest and back knife wounds. Old bullet holes, marks of a hard life lived violently. He watched her face as she worked, his grey eyes inscrutable. When she tied off the final knot and bandaged the arm, she sat back, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Done." Garrett rolled his shoulder carefully. "Good work." He reached out with his good hand, his rough thumb tracing the line of her jaw, wiping away a smudge of soot. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. His eyes dropped to her lips, and for a terrifying, wonderful second, she thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, he dropped his hand. "You did good tonight, Rainey. You didn't freeze." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Terror is fine. Freezing is what gets you dead." Just then, heavy footsteps approached the open door. It was Red Cooley, the foreman, holding a battered leather saddlebag covered in mud. "Boss, we found this on the one with the checkered shirt. The leader." Garrett took the bag and dumped the contents onto the bed. Cartridges, a plug of tobacco, a handful of silver dollars, and a tightly rolled oilskin parchment. Garrett unrolled the parchment. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression hardening into granite. "Son of a bitch," he whispered. "What is it?" Rainey asked, leaning over to look. It was a surveyor's map of the territory. Serenity Springs was a small dot. Dead Man's Lake was there. And her father's farm, the worthless dust bowl abutting the canyon, was circled in red ink. But it was the markings beneath the surface that drew the eye. Massive blue lines, crisscrossing like veins under the skin of the earth. "It's an aquifer," Garrett said, his voice lethal. "A massive one. The biggest I've ever seen charted. It runs right under your father's land and feeds into the canyon deep underground. That's why the lake is drying up. The water table shifted, and it's all trapped down there." He pointed to a signature in the corner of the map dated 3 months prior, Jebediah Holt, surveyor. And beneath it, freshly scrawled notes in a different hand, rights to revert upon marriage or death of claimant. Proceed with purification ritual. MG. Malachi Graves. Rainey breathed horrified realization washing over her. The drought, the accusations, it was all a lie. "It was a land grab," Garrett said, crushing the map in his fist. "Holt found the water. He was going to marry you to get the land. When he died, Graves took over the plan. They had to kill you to ensure the land reverted to the bank so they could buy it at auction. The witch hunt was just theater to get the town to do their dirty work." Rainey felt sick. The faces of her neighbors on the dock, they hadn't been motivated by holy fear, but by the manipulative lies of greedy men. Garrett stood up, the pain in his arm ignored. He went to the wardrobe and pulled out a fresh shirt, shrugging into it carefully. He strapped his gun belt back on. "Red, saddle a fresh horse, and saddle 6 more for the boys. We ride in 10 minutes. "Garrett, no," Rainey said, standing up. "You said the land is safe because we are married. We have the map. We can go to the marshal in Laramie. We can fight this legally." Garrett turned to her. He looked like a warlord preparing for final battle. "The law is 3 days' ride away, Rainey. Graves is 3 hours away. He came into my home. He tried to kill my wife. He burned my land. If I wait for a marshal, Graves will send 20 more men tomorrow night. Out here, you don't survive by waiting for permission to defend what's yours." He walked over to her, tilting her chin up so she had to look him in the eye. "I told you this is a partnership. I need you to do your part now." "What is my part?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hold Iron Ridge," he commanded. "I'm taking my best gunmen. You're left with the old-timers, the Greenhorns, and Martha. You are Mrs. Thorne now. You are the mistress of this land. If anyone comes up that road that isn't me, you turn them back or you put them in the ground." He kissed her then. It wasn't gentle. It was hard, desperate tasting of whiskey and smoke and blood. It was a claim, a promise, and a goodbye, all at once. He pulled away abruptly, grabbed his rifle, and strode out of the room without looking back. Rainey stood in the center of the bedroom, the taste of him on her lips, the weight of his empire settling on her shoulders. She walked to the window and watched as 7 riders thundered out of the main gate, disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom toward Serenity Springs. She was alone. 2 days passed. 2 days of suffocating silence, broken only by the sounds of hammers rebuilding the hay barn. Rainey threw herself into the work. It was the only way to keep from going mad with worry. She wasn't just the water witch bride anymore. She was the woman holding the reins of the largest operation in the territory. It wasn't easy. The remaining hands, about 15 men, mostly older cowboys, too broken down for hard riding or young drifters, just learning the ropes, eyed her with suspicion. They muttered when she gave orders to shift cattle to the south pasture or to double the night watch. But the real problem wasn't suspicion. It was Brodie Vance. Vance was a drifter who had been hired on just before the drought got bad. He was a handsome man, in a slick, oily sort of way, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had been part of the group that stayed behind claiming a lame horse, but Rainey had seen the way he looked at Garrett's back as he rode out a look of pure venom. On the afternoon of the second day, Rainey was in Garrett's study, trying to make sense of the ranch ledgers. Martha brought in a tray of coffee. "You need to eat, child," Martha said gently. "You're fading away." "I'm fine, Martha. Has there been any word? Any riders from the east?" "No, ma'am. But the wind is picking up. Feels like a storm coming." Rainey looked out the window. The sky was turning a bruised purple color. "Martha, what do you know about Brodie Vance?" Rainey asked suddenly. Martha's lips pursed. "A snake in a Stetson. He's lazy, he cheats at cards, and he talks too much when he drinks. Mr. Thorne was planning on firing him after the roundup." "I think he's talking to someone outside the ranch," Rainey said, tapping the ledger. "There are supplies missing. Grain ammunition. Small amounts, but consistent over the last month." Martha's eyes narrowed. "You think he was feeding information to Graves?" "I think Vance goes wherever the money is easiest, and right now he thinks Iron Ridge is vulnerable." That evening, the storm broke. It wasn't rain, but wind, a howling gale that whipped the dust into blinding clouds and rattled the windows of the big house. Rainey couldn't sleep. She sat in the parlor with a shotgun across her lap, watching the fire die down. Around midnight, she heard a noise. Not the wind. The creak of a floorboard in the hallway. She stood up noiselessly, shifting into the shadows of the doorway. A figure moved past the parlor door, heading toward the study where the ranch safe was kept. It was Vance. He wore his gun belt low, and he moved with a stealth that didn't belong to an honest cowpuncher. Rainey followed him. She watched from the doorway of the study as Vance knelt before the large iron safe. He pulled a small crowbar from his belt and jammed it into the crack of the door, leaning his weight into it. "It won't open that way, Brodie," Rainey said clearly. Vance spun around, dropping the crowbar. His hand flew to his holster, but stopped when he saw the twin barrels of the shotgun aimed at his chest. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his oily smile sliding onto his face, though his eyes darted around the room nervously. "Couldn't sleep. Heard a noise in here. Thought it might be another raider." "Don't lie to me," Rainey said, her voice steady, channeling the cold authority she had seen Garrett use on the dock. "You're stealing, and I'd bet my life you're the one who told Graves when the barn watch would be lightest." Vance's smile dropped. "You're smart for a farm girl. Shame Garrett picked you up before I got a chance to introduce myself. Empty your gun belt on the floor. Slowly." Vance chuckled darkly. "Now, Rainey, honey, you ain't gonna shoot me. That gun's too big for you. Besides, you think these old farts on the ranch are gonna take orders from a drowning witch over me. Garrett's dead by now. Graves has 50 men waiting for him in the canyon. This place is finished." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Garrett. Dead. No. She refused to believe it. "I said empty your belt." "No." Vance sneered. "I don't think I will. I think I'm gonna take what's in that safe, and then maybe I'll take something else before I leave." He took a step toward her, his eyes raking over her nightgown. Rainey didn't hesitate. Garrett's words echoed in her mind. "Terror is fine. Freezing is what gets you dead." She shifted her aim down and pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the confined space. The load of buckshot tore into the floorboards inches from Vance's boot, sending splinters flying into his leg. He howled in pain and stumbled backward, crashing into the desk. "The next one is higher, Brodie." Rainey cocked the second barrel. "Try me." Vance looked at her, clutching his bleeding calf. The sneer was gone, replaced by shock and fear. He realized too late that the girl from the lake had drowned, and something much harder had taken her place. Before he could move, the lights flared on in the hallway. Martha stood there, holding a kerosene lamp high, a heavy cast-iron skillet gripped in her other hand. Behind her were 3 of the older ranch hands, rifles raised, woken by the shot. "What in tarnation is going on?" old Gus the bunkhouse cook bellowed. "Mr. Vance was just resigning," Rainey said coldly, never taking her eyes off the traitor. "He decided Iron Ridge wasn't the place for him. Gus, tie him up and throw him in the root cellar. If he tries to run, shoot him." Gus looked from the bleeding man to the unwavering woman holding the shotgun. He spat on the floor. "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Thorne. With pleasure." As they dragged a cursing Vance away, Martha walked over to Rainey. The older woman's face was stern, but her eyes shone with a new respect. "You all right, child?" Rainey lowered the shotgun, her arms finally starting to tremble. "He said Graves has 50 men waiting in the canyon. He said it's an ambush." Martha's face paled. If Vance knew it's true, Mr. Thorne walked right into a trap. Rainey looked out the rain-streaked window into the pitch-black night. The storm was raging outside, matching the one inside her. Garrett had saved her when no one else would. He had given her a home, a name, and the means to fight back. Now he was outnumbered, riding into a slaughter. She turned back to Martha. The trembling stopped. Martha opened the gun cabinet. "I need a repeater rifle and a coat that isn't a dress. And wake up the boy, Timmy. He's the lightest rider we have." "What are you going to do?" Martha asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. "Garrett told me to hold Iron Ridge," Rainey said, her jaw setting. "But he's Iron Ridge, and I'm not going to let him die alone in the dark." The wind howled through the slot canyons of the Wyoming Badlands, a banshee scream that masked the sound of the lone rider navigating the treacherous slate-gray paths. Rainey rode a chestnut mare named Cinder, a horse chosen for speed and endurance. She wore a heavy canvas duster coat she had taken from the bunkhouse and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her eyes. The Winchester rifle was scabbarded at her knee, and the heavy Colt revolver was tucked into her belt. She looked nothing like the bride who had been thrown into the lake 3 days ago. That girl was dead. This was the mistress of Iron Ridge. She knew where they would be. The Devil's Throat, a narrow choke point in the canyon near her father's farm. It was the only way to approach the Serenity Springs settlement from the high ground without being seen. If Vance was right, Graves had set up a crossfire ambush there. Rainey didn't ride into the throat. She remembered playing in these rocks as a child, hiding from her father's drunken rages. She knew a goat path barely wide enough for a horse that climbed the ridge above the ambush point. It took 2 grueling hours to make the climb. Cinder slipped twice, sending showers of shale clattering down into the darkness. But the mare held true. When Rainey finally crested the ridge, she tied the horse to a scrub oak and crawled to the edge of the cliff, peering down into the abyss. The scene below made her blood turn to ice. The ambush had already happened. 3 of Garrett's men lay motionless near the entrance of the pass. 2 others were kneeling in the dirt, hands behind their heads, guarded by men holding torches. And in the center of the clearing, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was Garrett. He was tied upright to a heavy wagon wheel, his arms spread wide in a cruel mockery of a crucifixion. His shirt had been torn open, and his chest was a map of bruises and cuts. He was conscious, his head hanging low, blood dripping from his chin onto the dust. Reverend Malachi Graves stood before him, looking immaculate in his black frock coat, untouched by the dust or the violence. He held a lantern in one face, bringing it close to Garrett's face. Rainey lay on her stomach, looking through the sights of the Winchester. The range was long, nearly 200 yards. In the dark, with the wind gusting, a headshot was impossible. If she missed, they would kill Garrett instantly. She needed to get closer. She needed a distraction. Below, the wind carried Graves's voice, up the canyon walls amplified by the acoustics of the stone. "You see, Mr. Thorne," Graves preached, pacing back and forth, "this is the inevitable result of arrogance. You thought your money made you a god. You thought you could steal the judgment of the church, but out here there is only one law, survival of the righteous." Garrett spat a mouthful of blood at Graves's boots. "You're a thief in a priest's collar," he rasped. "You don't want righteousness. You want the water." Graves chuckled a dry, rattling sound. "The water is God's gift, and he has chosen me to distribute it. Once you are dead, your sham marriage will be annulled. The widow, if she even survives the night at your ranch, will be returned to my custody. She will sign the land over to the church as penance, and then, well, perhaps she will find the bottom of the lake again." Rainey felt a surge of rage, so hot it almost blinded her, but she forced herself to breathe. "Don't freeze." She scanned the canyon floor. Behind the men parked against the canyon wall was a supply wagon Graves's men had brought. It was covered in a tarp. Barrels were stacked next to it. Gunpowder whiskey. It didn't matter. It was flammable. Rainey shifted her aim. She wasn't aiming for a man. She was aiming for the lantern hanging on the side of that wagon. She took a deep breath, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The rifle shot echoed like a cannon blast in the confined space. The lantern on the wagon shattered. Burning oil splashed onto the dry canvas tarp. Within seconds, the wind whipped the spark into a roaring inferno. The horses tied nearby screamed and reared, tearing their picket lines. "What is that?" Graves shrieked, spinning around. "We're under attack! Douse the light!" Panic erupted below. Men scrambled, firing blindly into the darkness of the cliffs. The burning wagon illuminated the chaos, casting long, dancing shadows that confused the gunmen. Rainey scrambled down the shale slope, sliding more than walking, abandoning stealth for speed. She reached the canyon floor behind a cluster of boulders, 50 yards from Garrett. "Cut him down!" Graves screamed at his men. "Kill the prisoner! We're leaving!" A gunman raised his pistol toward Garrett's head. Rainey stepped out from the boulders, leveled her lever-action rifle, and fired from the hip. She didn't aim for the head. She aimed for the center of mass. The bullet caught the gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his weapon, howling. "Get away from him!" Rainey screamed, her voice tearing through the wind. Silence fell over the clearing. The burning wagon crackled and popped. Everyone turned to look at the figure emerging from the smoke. She stood tall, her duster coat billowing like a cape, the firelight reflecting in her fierce green eyes. She pumped the lever of the Winchester, loading a fresh round with a metallic clack-clack that was louder than the storm. Garrett lifted his head. Through his swollen eyes he saw her. A ghost. An angel numb. His wife. "Rainey," he whispered, a mixture of horror and awe in his voice. "Run." "I'm done running," she said, her voice steady. Reverend Graves stared at her, his face twisting from shock into a rictus of hate. "The witch," he hissed. "You should be dead. You should be at the bottom of Dead Man's Lake." "The lake didn't want me," Rainey said, walking forward, the rifle never wavering from Graves's chest, "and neither does hell, so I guess I'm staying right here." "Kill her," Graves commanded his remaining 10 men, but the men hesitated. They looked at the burning wagon. They looked at the woman who had appeared out of the storm like a vengeance spirit, and they looked at the ridge above her, wondering how many more gunmen were hiding in the dark. "There are 20 rifles aimed at you from the cliffs," Rainey lied, her voice projecting with absolute authority. "My foreman has you bracketed. Drop your guns or you'll all die here." It was a bluff, a desperate, terrified bluff. For a second it worked. The hired guns looked at each other nervously. They were paid to fight cowboys, not armies. But Graves wasn't a hired gun. He was a fanatic. He saw the tremble in Rainey's hand. He saw the desperation in her eyes. "She's lying," Graves sneered. He drew a long-barreled revolver from his coat. "She is alone. A woman alone is nothing." He raised the gun. Rainey braced herself. She couldn't shoot Graves without exposing herself to the other 10 men. This was it. Suddenly a gunshot rang out. But it didn't come from Graves, and it didn't come from Rainey. It came from the darkness behind Graves. Graves's gun hand jerked a hole appearing in his sleeve. He dropped the revolver with a cry of pain. From the shadows of the rocks, a man stepped forward. He held an old rusted shotgun. He looked ragged, broken, and terrified, but he stood his ground. "Arthur!" Graves gasped, clutching his bleeding arm. Rainey's breath caught in her throat. "Father." Arthur Sterling stood there, shaking. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. He saw the bruises on her wrists from the rope. He saw the strength in her stance, and he saw the monster he had almost sold her to. You said it was God's will." Arthur stammered, his voice cracking. "You said she would be saved if she was innocent, but you just wanted the land. You wanted the water." "Arthur, you fool," Graves snarled. "Kill her, and I will forgive your debts. I will make you rich." Arthur looked at the shotgun in his hands. Then he looked at Rainey. Tears streamed down his weathered, dirt-streaked face. "I'm already in debt," Arthur whispered. "To her." Arthur racked the slide of the shotgun. "Let them go, Malachi." The distraction was all the opening Garrett needed. Despite his injuries, he summoned a reserve of strength born of pure fury. He strained against the ropes binding his wrists. The charred wood of the wagon wheel, weakened by age and stress, groaned. With a roar that sounded like a grizzly bear, Garrett ripped his right hand free, the rope snapping with the force of his pull. He didn't wait. He ignored the pain in his torn muscles. He lunged forward, grabbing the knife from the belt of the nearest stunned guard. "Rainey, get down!" Garrett roared. Rainey dropped to the dirt just as hell broke loose. The canyon exploded into chaos. Garrett shattered the charred wagon wheel, tearing his bonds with a roar that echoed off the cliffs. He plunged into the fray, a whirlwind of vengeance, while Rainey's rifle cracked from the boulders, her cover fire pinning Graves's mercenaries. Cornered and desperate, Reverend Graves scrambled for his fallen revolver, aiming it squarely at Rainey. "Die, witch!" he screamed. But the shot that rang out didn't come from him. Graves's gun flew from his hand, shattered by a blast from the shadows. Arthur Sterling stepped into the firelight, a smoking shotgun in his trembling hands. For the first time in his life, he chose his daughter over his fear. Garrett lunged, tackling Graves and pinning him to the dirt, his knife pressed against the preacher's throat. His eyes burned with lethal intent. "No!" Rainey cried, rushing forward and placing a hand on Garrett's heaving chest. "Don't become the monster he is, Garrett. Let the law hang him. We've won." Garrett stared at her, the bloodlust slowly fading, replaced by exhaustion and awe. He dropped the knife, letting his men drag the sobbing preacher away. At that exact moment, the heavy clouds finally broke. Rain, cool, heavy, and relentless, washed over them, cleansing the blood from the dust. The drought was over. 3 months later, Iron Ridge was unrecognizable, lush with green grass and wildflowers. On the porch of the ranch house, Garrett took Rainey's hand. He didn't offer a diamond. Instead, he slipped a gold band set with a polished river stone onto her finger. "To replace the rope," he whispered, pulling her close. Rainey smiled, kissing the man who had ridden into the water to save her. The drowning bride was gone. The queen of the high country had taken her place. And so Lorraine Rainey Sterling didn't just survive the water. She mastered it. She proved that sometimes the person you think is your savior needs saving just as much as you do. Their love wasn't written in the stars. It was forged in mud blood and gunpowder. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about saddling up and riding into the dark when everyone else tells you to stay put. If this story of Wild West justice and romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this with someone who loves a good cowboy drama, and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have plenty more tales from the frontier coming your way. Thanks for watching.